Hello everyone. We are going to now be covering the rights issues, and we're going to start with the first and the most important piece of fundamental rights, which is Article 19. And I'll quickly adjust the broad contours of this. Alright, so we're going to now be covering Article 19, and when we cover Article 19, so the first thing we must sort of understand when we do rights issues with respect to polity is that the kind of questions that are asked in rights issues are, as we discussed with previous year questions, one, if there is a Supreme Court judgment on the constitutionality of a law which violates a fundamental right, and if the judgment has already been delivered, then in such a scenario you would usually get an impact question, that what follows up post this judgment. But if this is something which is in the news and the judgment is yet to be delivered and it still is not extraordinarily clear as to what happens to the constitutionality of it, then of course your opinion could be asked on whether this is right or wrong, and so on and so forth. Now, Article 19 is a standard favorite of the exam, largely because the number of issues that emanate out of Article 19 are perhaps the largest, and also with very specific ramifications. Not only this, Article 19 is not only used across your GS papers, whether it is paper 1, 2, 3 or 4. You can also be expecting essays on democracy, on the role of the media and the role of information in a democracy. So what I'm going to give and sort of teach you today is a combination of everything which covers all possible dimensions on rights issues. We'll start with Article 19, then move to 21, and then close your larger issues, because 14 is implied under 19 and 21. The one thing is absolutely sure, that we don't need to prepare opinions on reservation, nor do we need to prepare opinions on religion per se, and also caste. The kind of questions that are asked here are always very non-controversial. So with respect to reservation, your questions would be, are the bodies responsible for reservation doing a good job, or a context of reservation to center-state relations in the context of the most recent constitutional amendment. With respect to religion, we look at larger aspects of how the government takes care of secularism, and not particularly the matters of concern in and around secularism in India. And with respect to caste also, we have to sort of again remember this on the same lines as reservation. So let's start. What I've given you first here is a quote. This quote is by Justice Bhagwati in the Menka Gandhi versus Union of India case of 1978, which is one of the most important cases, not only for 19 but also for 21 as well, but 19 definitely is the primary concern of the case. This quotation should only and only be used in an essay. Please don't use this quotation in your GS answers because of the sheer length of it. If you do want to use this quotation in your GS answers, you should ideally paraphrase this quotation and only use bits and pieces of this, so that you're able to understand this in a larger domain. So the quotation very clearly reads, democracy is basically based essentially on free debate and open discussion, and for that is the only correlative of government action in a democratic setup. If the democracy means government of the people and by the people, it is obvious that the citizens must be entitled to participate in a process, and for citizens to intelligently participate in this process, it is absolutely important that an informed right of making a choice and discussion on public matters is absolutely essential. This is not a very thrilling definition, but sort of encompasses the intent of participation in information. Very quickly, I've sort of listed down the major rights under Article 19, and it is because of these rights, it is because of what happens with these rights, do you have a lot of issues that come around it. The first and the most important is, of course, the freedom of speech and expression. And it is from here, it is from speech and expression that you would see a lot of correlated issues that come out, such as, for example, such as there's going to be, say, defamation, or there's going to be contempt of court, or, for example, it's going to relate to press rights, or for example about censorship. So a lot of the issues that come out of freedom of speech and expression are essentially correlated around here, and we're going to cover them one by one and piece by piece. Then of course you also have the right to peaceful assembly, and that also without arms. In such a scenario, you would usually see questions around protest, you would see questions around strike, and a combination of both of these both of these sub-fundamental rights would be, let us say, more contemporary issues such as sedition, though I highly doubt the UPSC to particularly ask you a question on sedition per se. Then of course to form unions and associations, which in the context of farm protests becomes sort of relevant. The other fundamental rights under Article 19, which say that you have the right to move freely throughout the territory of India, or you have the right to reside and settle in any part of the territory, or you have the right to practice any profession or carry on any trade or business. I don't particularly see a direct question being asked in and around it, but you can use these fundamental rights as contexts to say larger questions on ILPs, on analysis of 370, Article 370, or let us say you would want to talk about online gaming, or for example Bitcoin for that matter. So somewhere fundamentally it is these rights that sort of come into being. For example, the inner line permit system is a reasonable restriction to move freely throughout the territory of India. Article 370 did place constitutional restrictions for you to reside and settle in any part of the territory of the country. And of course with newer modes of technology such as online gaming or online poker, or things like the Dream 11 or the fantasy leagues around sports, they're essentially to do with betting, and betting is fundamentally a questionable status as far as legality of occupations is concerned, and of course the legality of a Bitcoin. To be very clear, I don't think the UPSC is going to ask you, do you think online gaming should be legalized, and how do you place online gaming or online betting in the context of Article 19. Similarly, I don't see a question on Bitcoin very specifically in GS paper 2 saying analyze the legality of Bitcoin, because Bitcoin, as much as it is a legal issue, there's also a lot of financial and economic ramifications on the same, which is why I don't particularly see directed questions here. Now, the one thing I must also make explicitly clear is that the right to information, right, which has always been the news for quite some time, and it has been in the news not because of the right to information, but because of the changes that are made to the powers and the compositions of the bodies responsible for discharging the right to information, such as the Central Information Commission and the State Information Commission. Now, the right to information is an implied fundamental right under Article 19, and that's fundamentally where it originates from. And the basic discussion is, if I have the right to freedom of speech and expression, and for me to speak or express freely, I must have the information to speak and express freely, and therefore information becomes an important part of us. And because fundamental rights are essentially available against the state, so the right to information is for citizens to gather accurate information about the actions of the state. So this was sort of expanded to include the right to information and disseminate information in 1995. So no doubt the right to information is one important ramification of it, but also the freedom of access to internet, and at the same time the freedom to express yourself over the internet also becomes an implied identification of information. I might also make it very clear that I will not discuss the right to information as a rights issue, because this is more of an institutional issue as to what can we do to empower the RTI framework in the country, largely done in the context of the Central Information Commission and of course the State Information Commission. So in your introductions, you could probably write a shortened version of the quote, and secondly, you could also mention how international documents or international conventions such as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the European Convention on Human Rights, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, all of them guarantee freedom of speech and expression to people of countries all across the world. Now, because these are international documents, so they are persuasive in nature by definition, but when you add this this, you of course add a lot of brownie points to your answers, give your answers a more global perspective, which I think you definitely should write this in the mains. That the freedom of speech, and how would you write this in the mains? You would say that the freedom of speech is guaranteed, or freedom of speech and expression is guaranteed under Article 19 of the Indian Constitution, and is also celebrated or recognized through international documents such as UDHR, ICCPR, and so on and so forth. So this is a fair enough introduction. From here we then move on to say what your reasonable classifications are, and how do we essentially want to go about that, and how would you get a question here. So how reasonable are reasonable classifications is a very, very legal debate. So you will not get a question asking, analyze the reasonability of a reasonable classification. You would use this on an issue-based question. So, for example, when the UPSC asks, what do you think of hate speech? Is it under freedom of speech and expression or not? Or when the UPSC asks, why are films treated differently than the rest forms of expression, you could then correlate this to reasonability or some form of restrictions that we use. Like, for example, hate speech can affect the sovereignty and integrity of the nation. It can also have an impact on friendly relations with foreign countries. It can impact public order. It can impact security of the state. It can be indecent or immoral. It can also be defamatory, and also can incite to an offense. So these are the kind of reasonable restrictions. Some of them are explicitly mentioned in the Constitution, and some of course have been evolved through judicial pronouncements. So for example, defamation and contempt of court, these are things that are not very specifically just mentioned in the Constitution. This is essentially something that the courts have also evolved over a period of time. But of course, things like sovereignty, friendly relations, public order, security of the state, these are essentially explicitly mentioned in the Constitution, and of course deal with some form of reasonable restrictions. So the whole point of sort of teaching this to you is to tell you that you will not get a question asking you the reasonability of reasonable restrictions. You will use this as an argument on a specific issue. So for example, if it's hate speech, so on one hand you will say everybody has the right to freedom of speech and expression, and even if that speech is derogatory, you have the right to say it. But all rights are not absolute in nature, and the Constitution itself underlines certain restrictions in the forms of sovereignty, public order, security, etc., and therefore essentially protects your public from getting maligned because of hate speeches, which often can be delivered. We've done this sort of gone through it in the past year papers that we discussed in the first video that you would have seen on the playlist. So once you've understood this, in an essay, or if you get sometimes in the GS questions also, they ask you, what do you understand by the concept of freedom of speech and expression? Or they can ask you, why is freedom of speech and expression important? So how would you answer a question like that? A question like that must be answered in the most linguistically appealing manner. You must write it with a lot of thought. You must articulate it very, very well. And you must also, as I'm sure all of you would know, substantiate it with some contemporary examples to drill this into the notion of the examiner. So there are essentially 4 reasons why the freedom of speech and expression is important. 1, in a democracy, freedom of speech and expression is one of the most prime liberties guaranteed to citizens. In fact, it is the foundation to liberty. You cannot be a liberty-driven state if you do not have freedom of speech and expression. And therefore, it also becomes the basis of all other rights. Now, you must remember, like for example, in India, we do not have a dedicated set of press rights. Journalists and citizens in India enjoy the exact same freedom of speech and expression. And you would definitely remember this, that freedom of speech and expression is only available to citizens, and it is technically not available to foreigners, which means there are certain restrictions on who has the freedom under Article 19, so to speak, right? So it sort of is important for democracy from a country perspective. It sets the basis for other rights. It also helps you concretize the freedom of press, and therefore makes a more better informed public and electorate. So freedom of speech is fundamentally important for having something called a functional democracy. And once you're able to do that, you will be able to sort of build a more vibrant democracy. Second, it also creates a sense of accountability. It also allows citizens to express their opinions freely, also directly showcase their grievances. In fact, if you think of it, it can be a very significant tool of something called direct democracy, where the citizens can directly communicate whatever they are going through, whatever their grievances are, whatever their problems are, directly to the people, and we can have the government take cognizance of it and make sure that certain actions are made. At the same time, when you create your political leaders accountable by telling them that X is not working, or by making sure information is freely and readily available, it makes sure that everybody is adequately informed. And you must understand this. Freedom of speech is not just about citizens expressing. It is also about the government communicating what it wants to the citizens. And once that happens, once that ecosystem is sort of built, you can then create what is called an information-driven environment. Third, it is extremely important to uplift the marginalized and the minority sections of the country, because they are marginalized and they are a minority section largely because they have been oppressed, because of some ill will that has been wetted out against them through centuries and centuries of abuse and discrimination. And only when you have the freedom to express yourself, only when you have the ability to speak to yourself and speak to people around you and tell the government and everybody else around that, listen, this has been done to us, this is why we are feeling what we are feeling, this is what the government has done which has worked, this is what the government has done which has not worked. For all of these reasons, you will be able to then have better empowerment of the minority sections of society. And fourthly, it is the very backbone of creativity in a country. It allows for artists of any form, and artists are not just painters, musicians or directors or actors. Artists could be cartoonists, they could be comedians, they could be anybody. And in fact, anybody who's writing also is in a way an artist, because you are creating something which is your own. So if you want some form of creativity, if you want some form of individuality, you would definitely want to have a degree of freedom of speech and expression. So you can use these 4 points and substantiate it with some form of examples, such as we talk about, say, the right to information or press rights here. In the second point, we talk about again the right to information. We talk about the citizens' grievance system. We talk about all of those things. The reason we do is because we are then able to communicate to the government. Third, we then talk about how there have been instances of caste-based violence, there have been instances of religion-based violence, there have been communal riots. Unless they're reported entirely, of course, how else will you stop them from happening, right? And lastly, and like for example, very recently, there were news reports of delayed payments on the basis of caste for MG Narega beneficiaries. So all of those things have to be reported out. And lastly, of course, you have the freedom of the media, the freedom of cinema, the freedom of OTT platforms. We talk about IT rules. All of those things become examples to these 4 broad points. Okay, so once we understand this, then we, of course, right at the very beginning, what we have is, what are the components of free speech, right? So free speech largely means 4 things, because this is where mostly your questions will be asked in GS paper 2. It means 4 things. First, the freedom of press. Second, the freedom and the right to remain silent. Third, the right to report and broadcast. And fourth, the right to be informed. These are fundamentally the 4 sort of facets of free speech. As I said before, while freedom of speech is freedom of the press is implied under Article 19, unfortunately, we don't have a dedicated set of rights probably giving more protections to journalists in our country, as we definitely hold the media as the fourth pillar of democracy. So that, of course, has been slightly compromised. And in fact, I've quoted the Constituent Assembly debates also, where one of the members of the Constituent Assembly, Damodar S. Seth, had said that we must have freedom of speech explicitly in the article where the press holds such immense value. But in India, we did not do that, and we said journalists are citizens and everybody has the right to essentially have an opinion and a public opinion on an issue. At the same time, if you have the right to talk, you also have the right to remain silent. And this right to remain silent also in today's technological age also is correlated to the right to be forgotten digitally, which becomes an important facet of privacy, which of course we will talk about in Article 21. Now, as much as you have the right to talk, you also have the right to remain silent. You have the right to not express, and you should not be compelled to express. Now, this case, the Bijoy Emmanuel and others versus State of Kerala case, and there's a reason I've not given you the year, because it becomes too much of memory for you. Just the case name is more than enough. In this case, the students in a school did not want to sing the national anthem, and the court said that just because you don't sing the national anthem, it does not violate the National Honours Act, and the students were not charged with anything. They were not held liable for anything because they had the right to remain silent. So that's an important judgment that you could remember. Thirdly, the right to report and broadcast. Now, you must understand, the right to report and broadcast may seem similar to the freedom of the press, but broadcast can also happen without the institutionalization of the press. It can also be done, especially nowadays, technologically. It could be done through social media. So all of us do have that right, but make sure modern day implications of this, of course, lead to fake news, lead to paid news, lead to trolls, lead to a lot of these unnecessary pieces of information, which can, of course, hamper with the tranquility of the society. Now, and then the larger question becomes, what do you have the right to report on? What do you have the right to say an opinion on? For example, you must understand that reporting is basically a presse writing of an event, whereas journalism is an opinion on something that has happened. So whether it is on the proceedings of the court of law, whether it is on the proceedings in the parliament, whether it is about the proceedings of the executive, you should have the right to report and broadcast on all the branches of government, whether it is the L, the E or the J, and all of them must necessarily be done. Then, of course, this becomes even more contemporarily relevant because of contempt of court, which of course has been a larger issue, and there have been larger questions on whether this should be criminalized or not in the first place, or should there be a criminalization of an action in the first place or not. Right now there is. Then, of course, the last component of free speech is the right to be informed. As we also have the right as citizens. As I said, if right to information gives us the ability to make better expressions, this information could be very specialized in nature. For example, in Union of India versus Association of Democratic Reforms, it was fantastically made very, very clear. It was fantastically made very, very clear that the candidates have to disclose certain financial, civil and criminal information about themselves, so that the voters can make an informed choice of who they want to vote as their representative in the elections. And this is one of India's most foundational election reforms also. It is one of India's most important election reforms also. Nowadays you would have heard of websites that say know your Neta or know your MP, and all of these are public documents, and they should be a part of public documents. So not only do actions of the state under Article 12, but even if somebody who wants to aspire to be a politician, you must be able to disclose everything that you know to the people at large. So these are your four major concerns that become important. Now, at the very outset, we must also have a database of judgments. A database of not more than 10 judgments that we will use for Article 19. And this is more than enough. I've divided the judgment into two parts. First are called landmark judgments, which essentially give you sort of theoretical explanations which give you sort of a conceptual clarity on what Article 19 means. And second is, of course, more practical based, very contemporary judgments that very specifically pick up specific implications of freedom of speech. So there are just essentially about three to four major landmark judgments. The first, of course, is Romesh Thapar versus Madras 1950, in which the Supreme Court said you have the right to propagate ideas and also circulate. Second is Sakal newspapers. This is the 1962 case. Again, there were certain restrictions made on circulations and on certain. The government essentially was trying to regulate the business aspects and the production aspects of the media, which is what had severely affected them. The government was not looking at curtailing the powers of the media, which is why the Supreme Court also said you have the right to freedom of speech and expression, but you don't have the right to effective or meaningful exercise. As long as you're exercising it, you're exercising it. We can't decide what is effective and what is not, what is meaningful and what is not. Which is why a lot of the news portals in the world today, especially a lot of news channels in the country today, who are not particularly doing a very good job of being a good news channel, they still have the right to freedom of speech and expression. So as much as you have a bunch of news channels which do not cover the news that should be covered, or may come across as being slightly biased to a certain section in the country, they also have the same right as you and I do. So if we have the right to say that this is something that should not be reported on, or if we have a right to say that the media is biased, the media also has the right to be biased. So that's fundamentally where the right comes from, which is why it becomes a more of an ethical debate than the legal debate, right? And third, of course, the cases of Bennett Coleman and Indian Express. Indian Express was also very recently used in the Manohar Lal Supreme Court judgment, an interim order, in fact, where the Supreme Court has ordered a committee on the Pegasus matter. In this specific case, both of these cases, there were again certain regulations that were made. For example, in the Indian Express newspaper's case, the paper was basically challenging certain minimum wages and certain circumference requirements on newspaper prices that were being regulated by the government. And the Supreme Court said, as long as you have the right to freedom of speech, and you also have the right to freedom of speech of corporations, which means any of these regulations are not taking away your freedom of speech. You have the right to continue what you have to. Of course, anything outside the reasonable restrictions is not going to be taken into account, and if the government is curtailing your freedom of speech and expression, it has to be strictly within the realms of reasonable restrictions. It can't go beyond it. And lastly, of course, and this is in a chronological order, in Menka Gandhi versus Union of India, the Supreme Court also said that it's not just about speaking in India and about India. You have the right to speak freely anywhere you want to, wherever you want to, and whatever you want to. As India, we will not stop our citizens from having an opinion. Okay, so these are about, say, 4 or 5 such judgments, and then you have a few contemporary judgments, right? This is again something that you can use in contemporary context. So in 1997, in the PUCL versus Union of India case, the Supreme Court very interestingly said that wiretapping and all of those things is illegal unless you're doing it for national security reasons or for greater good. Second is in the Union of India versus Association of Democratic Reforms, which we had spoken about 2 slides ago also, said whether it's a one-side fact or disinformation or misinformation, everybody has the right to say what they want to. So to say that all of this is leading to a democracy is also all lopsided. So no doubt you should have the right to speak what you want to, say what you want to, publish what you want to. But at the same time, if somebody has the right to say what they want to, the other person also has the right to correct what the other person has said. So yes, this becomes important. Third, this is a case that I'm sure a lot of you would have heard of, is the Rakesh Om Prakash Mehra and other versus Government of India, versus Government of Delhi 2013. Now, Rakesh Om Prakash Mehra might sound familiar to you. He was the director of a very popular movie that I'm sure may have inspired a lot of you. I think it was Rang De Basanti, correct me if I'm not wrong, said that the Constitution of India not only guarantees you the freedom of speech, this is very interesting, but also freedom after speech, which means people cannot, just because you said something which might seem objectionable, and then people start beating you up, or then people start, treating you differently. That is not allowed. Right. This is a case that I'm sure everybody knows about, the Shreya Singhal case, where Section 66A was struck down by the Supreme Court as it was violating the Information Technology Act. It basically said that anything which gives an unquestionable administrative direction, anything which gives any form of administrative discretion to the government, and if this is not reasonable enough, then of course you will have to strike it down, because you have to assume that people have the right to freedom of speech and expression. And most recently, in Anuradha Bhasin versus Union of India in 2020, the Supreme Court had ruled that the freedom to access the internet is a fundamental right and is protected under 19 clause 1 clause A. I will talk about the freedom of internet in the next few upcoming slides, because freedom of internet means two things. First, the freedom to access the internet, which is a positive right, and the freedom to speak freely over the internet, which is a negative right. So freedom to access the internet is a right which is dependent on infrastructure, and you can force on the government to make sure that everybody has an internet connection, because that is as good as a directive principle, and the government cannot be sort of blocked into a corner and said, you have the right to freedom of speech over the internet, so it's the government's responsibility to provide everybody internet. That would be asking too much of the state. Also, if the state wants to, when it wants to, why not, right? So these are the broad kind of judgments. This is the broad connotation. With this, you know what is Article 19, what are the reasonable restrictions, why is it important, and some landmark judgments on it. This should answer any theory-based question that comes out of Article 19. Now, once we know the theory-based questions out of Article 19, in just one page each, we should know some very specific implications of Article 19, right? So one of the first, of course, is the right to protest. This becomes important largely in the context of protests that were made to farm laws, and also protests to the Citizenship Amendment Act 2019, where several people were arrested. So the right to protest is actually enshrined in the Constitution. People have the right to assemble peacefully without arms and say what they have to say, their piece. However, public order, which is a reasonable restriction, was not an original part of the Constitution. It was added through the first Constitutional Amendment 1951. Now you would know why so, because you've discussed this in Article 368, because of land reforms which are also sort of happening and was causing a lot of pushback to our landlords. Public order very simply means an absence of violence and an orderly state of affairs where citizens can peacefully sort of pursue their normal avocation of life. It also includes public safety. And just by the way, the criticism of the government does not necessarily mean there is an abuse or disturbance of public order. When we look at a broader interpretation of this, it means Article 19 includes the right to freely express opinions on the conduct of the government, and therefore you have the right to association for political purposes. You also have the right to, as political parties, as citizenship bodies, as university groups, to come and say what you want to, in of course a peaceful manner, in a non-seditious manner, quote unquote, on demonstrations, agitations, public meetings, and so on and so forth. And I've just given you one specific judgment for this. This is with respect to the protests of the Jan Lokpal movement. This is where you had the Ramlila Maidan versus Home Secretary, Union of India 2012, where it has been said that citizens have a fundamental right to assembly and peaceful protest, which cannot be taken away by arbitrary executive or legislative action. So this is more than enough as far as right to protest is concerned. You would not need anything else. Now, when we look at sedition, and just to give you context, this is a very popular cartoon from R.K. Lakshman from 1962. R.K. Lakshman was one of India's most well-known cartoon satirists, and this basically says, of course you were not spreading rumors, the charge is that you were spreading facts. So this was a satirical take on sedition. So let's understand sedition in one line, and as UPSC aspirants, the chances of you getting a direct question on sedition is almost negligible. So all you need to know is basically this. One, Section 124A of the Indian Penal Code is the law on sedition. This is a colonial law, has been there pre-independence. Though the problem is the explanations of the section very clearly says whoever by word spoken or written in any way is trying to spread hatred or contempt against the government and very specifically seeking to incite violence, in that case would you be charged with sedition. Though the law is sort of clear on it, there is also Supreme Court judgment on Kedarnath, which I'll come to in a minute. The idea here is the problem with sedition is that it still gives the government a lot of discretion, because you may want to prevent some form of violence from happening, or you could attribute violence to any speech given in a reasonable time frame anyway. The problem is, for an act to amount to sedition, there must be a legitimate intention to cause public disorder, disturbance, or hinder public speech or public peace. If it's not happening, then it's not sedition. The problem is, this has sometimes been used in the wrong manner, where innocent people may or may not have been charged with sedition. Now, Supreme Court has given very clear judgments on this. First is the Kedarnath judgment, where very clearly Supreme Court says only if there is an incitement of violence or disruption of law should you charge somebody with sedition. Second, the Supreme Court also said what you said, and there has to be a degree of proximity. What you said, and because of what you said, there is some public disorder, there must be some closeness to it. It can't be that you made a speech 3 months ago and there's a riot today, so the government is picking you up for a speech that you said 3 months ago, right? The problem is there has been a continuous trend where sedition law has not been used in its right format, and the Supreme Court has stepped in. In fact, the most recent occurrence, which almost everybody spoke of, was the Vinod Dua case, who is a veteran journalist, and the Supreme Court held his journalistic freedom, said that every journalist has right to protection, and the sedition law should be applied as per the Kedarnath judgment. Basically what had happened, for those of you who are interested, is that a BJP leader in Himachal Pradesh had filed an FIR against Vinod Dua for criticizing the Prime Minister and the Union government on his YouTube channel. The Supreme Court had quashed the FIR, saying that the FIR is non-maintainable, largely because what has been done is in the larger context of the freedom of speech, and it did not particularly incite violence. Now, once we've understood this, then we look at hate speech. This has been asked previously, so I don't see this to be asked directly again, but again, you may want to use this in an essay at some given point of time. So, it's hate speech versus the right to free speech and expression, and let's understand what this is. So, very simply, let's get what hate speech means. See, in contemporary times, it is often used as a tool to gain popularity. You know, like for example, clickbait videos. The videos that I make barely get 10,000 views, because I don't sit and dance around and talk about things that are not relevant to UPSC aspirants. But I often see a lot of YouTube channels talking about the powers of UPSC aspirants, the powers of civil servants, or any of those things. Now, that's not hate speech, but the fact is, all of this is driven to gain popularity. All of this is driven to gain sort of validation. Now, there is an ethical need. I mean, you are consuming the time of the students by even subjecting them to 5 minutes of these clickbait videos, and that I find objectionable at an ethical standpoint. But anyways, that aside, when that takes a dangerous turn, when that takes an almost criminal turn, that becomes an issue of what is called hate speech. So it manifests into a form which creates divisions in society by, attempting to belittle very specific groups of people based on their religion, culture, ethnicity, race, orientation, etc., etc. It is contrary to the objective of the fundamental right to free speech and expression, that is to liberate people from all strata of society. Therefore, it often relies on and perpetuates stereotypes. Hate speech will always come up with things that are spoken about behind closed doors publicly. That's one of the key sort of notorieties of hate speech. So hate speech has often been seen, has always often been seen to be used post-elections to cause anti-minority incitements. It is often used as a tool for politics of violence and hatred. And this is why we've taken a very strong view on it. See, very, very clearly, the Constitution of India by law seeks to prevent the delivery of hate speech. It does not come under Article 19. Not only this, even in our fundamental duties, the citizens have a responsibility to develop scientific temper, humanism, and the spirit of inquiry and reform. And all of these things are against the very ideals of this hate speech, and there are criminal laws in India which also penalize hate speech. In fact, very recently, in the case of Dr. Das Rao Deshmukh versus Kamal Kishore Nana Sahib Kadam, the appellant had sought votes by using a poster that said, "Teach a lesson to the Muslim community." The Supreme Court very clearly and very categorically held that the poster cannot be justified as it threatens to arouse communal feelings which can create a sense of disharmony between the communities. It was offensive and it did go against the secular structure of the country. So yes, extremely important, hate speech must be taken care of. And this is all you need to know as far as UPSC is. What is hate speech? Does it come under Article 19? Do we prevent it? What is not hate speech? And a judgment on it. That's it. You got to not write more than 100 words on it. So let's not get too much into details around it. Now, contempt of court is a common topic between judiciary and rights because it also is something that judicial reforms are also based on. This has suddenly shot into the news largely because of the Prashant Bhushan case, wherein now there is a larger discussion on whether the Contempt of Courts Act 1971 is the act justified in the first place or not? So let's understand this from a larger context. The idea is you can restrict freedom of speech or expression if the restriction is reasonable and fair and if it amounts to contempt of court. Now, contempt of court has been revised thrice. It was first a pre-British legislation in 1926, then it in 1952, and then you finally had the 1971 Contempt of Court Act. The Contempt of Courts Act of 1971 says you've got civil contempt and criminal contempt. Both of these. You've got civil contempt and you've got criminal contempt. Now, civil contempt is very simply, you do not want to follow the orders of the court. You are going against the orders of the court. So civil is basically being disobedient to court. Whereas criminal contempt on the other hand is you saying something which is either derogatory to the court or the judge. And I'm sure you would know the law on it. The Supreme Court punishes for its own contempt, whereas the High Court punishes for its contempt and the contempts of lower courts as well. So in that sense, the High Courts actually have wider contempt powers than the Supreme Court. Though the contempt law in 2006 was amended and was amended to make truth a defense. Now, if you think about it rationally, contempt of court, parliamentary privileges and defamation are actually three sides to the same coin. Not only two sides, but three sides to the same coin. Because whether it is defamation or parliamentary privileges or contempt of court, all of this is essentially a question mark on an opinion against something. So parliamentary privileges is when an MP or an MLA is saying something on the floor of the House. Contempt of court is when somebody is saying something against the court. Defamation is for everybody. So defamation is a broad term, and then you have privileges and contempt. And for those of you who understand defamation, truth is a defense in defamation. So that does not mean that just because you're saying the truth, you can say it however you want to. It also means, why are you saying the truth the way you are saying the truth? So if your truth is being said in such a way that you want to deliberately scandalize the court, it could be contempt of court. But for example, if you've written an article that says Supreme Court has done A, B, C, D, E for XYZ reasons, and I don't agree with the reasons, the judgment is flawed. That's okay, because that's fine, that's your opinion. But at the same time, if you say something so scandalous that, for example, let us say you say something unbelievably scandalous about the Supreme Court or the High Court, that might be objectionable. Okay, alright. Of course, even after this, if you are saying something, even after this amendment, if you're saying something which is not in public interest, you could still be charged with contempt of court. With respect to contempt of court, the Prashant Bhushan case is not a judgment on contempt, in the sense that it is not giving you a new implication to contempt. It is just an application of the existing laws on contempt. It was actually in 2017 in the Ram Beniwal versus in the Ram Beniwal versus Raghuveer Singh case, where the Supreme Court has said use it in as rare as possible. Don't make it a daily affair. Only if something is truly undermining the context of the judiciary or the position of the judiciary is when you should really take it up and make it happen. Right? Apart from this, of course, there's fake news. Fake news becomes important largely in the context of technology. So technology, social media, cheaper access to internet, TRP races are major contributors. How does fake news happen? This is something you should write. And if you want, you can actually make a flow chart out of this and give some contemporarily clear examples of it. If you want, you can always go to websites such as Alt News, pick up a few examples before your mains, and you're sorted. So fake news usually happens in this ways. First, you are trying to target a very specific minority by spreading news that they are responsible for a violent activity. Second is you start targeting specific individuals to tarnish their credibility and reputation, saying that X person has done this or X person is responsible for this. Third, you start making heroes out of nobodies, so that they get a lot of mass validation, and of course you could use it for political outcomes. And fourth, this was especially seen in the context of the pandemic, where you saw a lot of fake treatments and a lot of fake remedies which were being circulated, fake sort of paranoia was being regulated, was being circulated through social media, and people started to suffer actually. Now the question is, if this is how it happens, we must also know why it happens. It largely happens for three reasons. One is that this is slowly becoming an increasingly important tool by the politicians of the country because it's easy to polarize and then garner votes. And two is technology, and cheaper technology and affordable access to internet has made everybody become an internet celebrity or an opinionated person. Third is a lot of the tech companies, a lot of the big data companies, a lot of the social media intermediaries or fiduciaries, as our laws would like to call, their business models run on numbers, on eyeballs, right? So for example, some of the most popular edtech platforms in the country judge the worth of an educator by the number of views that an educator gets. Just because an educator has millions and millions of views does not necessarily make the educator good, relevant, or important for aspirants. That's also the case with UPSC, with YouTube also, and I keep coming back to these examples because this is actually true. So educators with a fancy following, or educators with like, and especially in the online space, they might be great, but they might necessarily not be very good for UPSC. They might not be very relevant for UPSC. So all of those things become sort of important as well. This is especially true with modern day tech platforms, which treat students as subscribers and not students, which I think is a fundamental problem. So we must remember these things. These have to be taken into account in a larger context. So the idea is that business models have been built in such a way. Advertisers are willing to pay for the reach that you can get. So if advertisers are willing to pay for the reach that you can get, and what you have to do to get to that reach, for example, if you have to spread fake news which is read by millions of people, then probably advertisers will pay you more because your platform then has that kind of a reach. So it is a vicious circle, and it is not just a legal issue, it's also an ethical issue. And for this, in 2020, the Supreme Court in Alok Srivastava versus Union of India did recognize the problem of infodemics in India and said that the governments must try to comply with the directions and of the court and to sort of spread the menace of fake news. And the Supreme Court had given guidelines on this a few years ago, and this was a major issue. I remember, I think around 2012, 13, 14, around that time, right? So that is that. Now, there are laws in India. For example, you've got the IT Act, you've got the Disaster Management Act, and you've got the Indian Penal Code, which very specifically places certain restrictions on the spread of fake news. And at the same time, what we should do is we must consistently invest in voter awareness, voter literacy, robust fact-checking environments, and so on and so forth. And the government should act as a prompt investigator, and social media platforms must also self-regulate themselves to an extent and to a capacity that sort of allows them to be more moral and more ethical players in the larger realm of awareness. Okay, so that's what it is as far as it is concerned. Now, this is something which is in the news recently, and the UPSC has asked questions on cinema. So this is about the cinematograph bill. To sort of give you a basic concept of this, what happens is, so first things first, the context to this is that in April 2021, the government enacted the Tribunal Reforms Act, and I'm going to cover tribunalization and judicial reforms anyway. So the government enacted the Tribunal Reforms Act, and in which a certain number of tribunals were abolished. One of those tribunals that we are talking about is called the Film Certificate Appellate Tribunal. The Film Certificate Appellate Tribunal, FCAT. Now, this tribunal is where you appeal decisions of the censor board, so that everybody has due process of law, and everybody is able to have a just principles of natural justice. Now, this law basically does what? Because you don't have an appellate tribunal anymore, and interestingly, the government appoints the censor board, and what this does is it gives the central government certain additional powers, that if the censor board has, for example, given a certificate to film, the central government can tell the censor board, please revise your certificate. And this the central government can do on the basis of anybody informing the central government that, listen, we saw the film, it doesn't deserve any certificate. So this is basically what is happening. So what is it? It basically gives revisionary powers to the union government, and on the basis of any reference, which is the problem. The first problem is the fact that you're giving revisionary powers, and second issue is that you're doing it on the receipt of any reference. Right? Now, a film which is duly passed by the Central Board of Film Certification can be now recensored if the central government says so. The problem here is the film is already in the theaters, which means a lot of money has been spent on marketing, on publicity. Theaters are executing it. This is going to massively impact the film industry. Not only this, because of the fear of a film being recalled, filmmakers in our country will play safe. They will self-regulate themselves. They will say that, boss, I don't want my films to be recalled, so I'm not going to make films on sensitive issues which the government may take an objection to. And from an institutional point of view, of course, amendments like these do affect the autonomy of bodies such as the Central Board Film Certification. And this, of course, is ironical because it's the government who appoints the censor board. So it is your people that you are asking to reconsider a decision that your people have made. Now, this is very objectionable because the Supreme Court in K.M. Shankarappa versus Union of India in 2000 very clearly said, once the film has been certified in compliance with the Cinematograph Act, there should not be any interference, because this would violate separation of powers, and of course the executive cannot override the decision of the judiciary. तो एक बार हो गया, सब क्लियर हो गया. Once the film has been due for release, whether it was challenged in a court once, जो भी था, एक बार हो गया. Once it's done and dusted. Don't think too much about it. Let it carry on. No questions at all. Right? Now, apart from this, you should also give a clarification on who, because who can sort of write to the central government and say, I have a problem with this bill, which is why political parties, vigilante groups, all of them can take an advantage of this, which is why it becomes a problem. So that's it. So what is the proposed amendment? Why did it happen? The context to it, objections to it, and how the Supreme Court has said a view on it, and what should we do to make the law better is that we should have clarity on who can give you an idea as to whether a film is objectionable or not, right? And speaking of this, then we of course look at the new IT rules, right? Now the new IT rules, this was in the news 2021. This is, I think, extremely important this year, because not only is this a question of law, this is also a question of ethics. So of course I have done this in a fair amount of detail. The notes are self-sufficient. So the full form of this is the New Information Technology Intermediary Guidelines and Digital Media Ethics Rules of 2021. They were designed to further empower the state and allow the executive have some sort of a power to shape public discourses. Now every state demands the state demands that information about content and information about origins of every digital communication should be given to the government if the government asks for it. It is basically a privacy versus national security debate. So this is largely a debate between privacy versus security, or privacy versus public order, if you'd like to call it. Now the other side to this is that digital content in itself is subject to both self-regulation and extensive surveillance, and regulations designed to allow substantial content by the executive over content. You are over-regulating something which is already self-regulated, and this could then of course further hamper privacy and individuality. This is the broad context to this. So this is good enough for an introduction. What is it called? What is the primary debate around it? And now of course I'll give you the detailed ones on it. There are essentially 4 basic questions. The 4 basic questions is, first, and to what extent can we curb hate speech and simultaneously ensure freedom of speech and expression, which is why hate speech will have another dimension on IT rules, which is why I'm doing IT rules after hate speech. Second, and this is a very important question, that on one hand we want to reduce hate speech, and at the same time we also want to ensure freedom of speech and expression. So how do we balance this? That how do we make sure that both are taken care of in their own right? The second fundamental debate is that can we, and if we can, how do we build regulatory systems which are transparent, which are accountable, which are fair, and ordinary, and they don't leave ordinary systems or ordinary citizens at the mercy of both technology and the government. See, the idea is there is government, there is big tech, and then there are citizens. So how do we build a framework where neither the citizens are getting abused by the government, nor are they getting abused by big tech companies, which is fundamentally where the problem lies. And the solution to this lies here itself. This is the fundamental problem. This is what we must do to solve it under all circumstances, right? And third, how do we protect ordinary citizens from surveillance, especially when we realize that in the data-driven world that we live in, it is almost an impossible thing to do. And fourth is, we understand big tech is a problem, but is the only solution to curbing big tech is to give the government more powers? Is that the only way we can go about it? These questions are definitely very legitimate legal ethics questions, and these questions have had extensive debates not just in India but of course all over the world. And this is why we have the IT rules of 2021 talking about it very specifically. Google, Facebook, WhatsApp, Telegram, Koo, ShareChat, LinkedIn, of course, have shared certain details with the Ministry of Information and Technology with the requirement of the new norms. Twitter, of course, is the one fighting a battle, and will, of course, has said that they will comply if the need might be. WhatsApp has filed a case in the Delhi High Court against the government challenging these rules, and independent media houses such as The Wire, Live Law, and Quint have largely questioned this and have severely criticized it. So this is essentially the repercussions. This is the response to these IT rules. Now let's understand what is it that we talk about. It basically talks about 3 things. Okay, first, it talks about a grievance mechanism. Right? It talks about how you'll have a grievance redressal officer who should be resident in India with specific focus on women, children from sexual offenses, fake news, and other forms of media. This is going to be a 3-level mechanism. First, you will have a grievance redressal officer. Then you will have self-regulatory bodies which will be registered with the Ministry of Information and Broadcasting. And you will have a charter for these bodies formulated by the Ministry of Information and Broadcasting, which still means we are not creating a censor board for social media. That's something which is very clear. This is still done on a self-censorship basis. This is the point which has sort of been a larger degree of controversy, that in case there is a message which is potentially going to cause a communal riot or has caused a communal riot, the person who sent the message for the first time, the details of that person must be disclosed to the government, and you should have a chief compliance officer submitting a monthly report of any complaints that are received to these companies by users, that we received this message seems to be objectionable. And third, and this is also important, how you have age guidelines for movies and everything else. We should also now start having self-classification into 5 categories, into 13 and higher. This will also should have age verification mechanisms, given the fact that online content can be objectionable to certain ages and audiences. So it becomes important. On top of this, you must understand why is this a big issue. Because, for example, WhatsApp has 340 million users in India, making India the largest WhatsApp user base in the world. Facebook has 290 million, Twitter has 17 million, YouTube has 265 million, Instagram has 120 million. India is a gold mine for these companies, largely because of the number that we have and because they run on those data-driven business models. So the tech giants cannot ignore the emerging challenges because their businesses is sort of dependent on us, and the challenges of fake news, rampant abuse of platforms, which can be sharing morphed images of women, deep fakes and other contents, they do have a lot of problem, right? And at the same time, instances of abuse of language, defamatory content, hate speech, they've all become very, very common. As recently, you would know, there have been internal studies of Facebook that have been leaked, and the newspapers couldn't stop talking about it for about a week. And the larger problem here with these issues primarily were the fact that the algorithms of these tech companies were not filtering them out, but in fact they were getting recycled and were getting more consumed by the people. The Supreme Court in 2018 in Tehseen Poonawalla versus Union of India very clearly directed the government to come up with guidelines to stop explosive messages and videos on social media which have a tendency to incite mob violence or lynching of any kind, right? And that is why the next issue is, agreed, we must stop this and we should stop this. But how do you do so? This means if the companies agree to sort of disclose who sent the message for the first time, end-to-end encryption becomes a problem. Second, the government says this only has to be done for very, very serious offenses. Now, what is very serious and what is non-serious is also very, very subjective. Third, and see, at the end of the day, the government doesn't know how to do this. It's the technological companies who will have to come up with technological solutions for this. You guys are the geniuses. You guys have to figure out how do we do this, and can we still do this without breaking end-to-end encryption. And third, it's not that you are not taking up information. Metadata of phone numbers, persons who are sending the locations are anyways shared with advertisers. In fact, WhatsApp had released a policy like that where metadata of WhatsApp users will be shared with advertisers, so that WhatsApp could also start looking at alternate sources of advertising revenue. So there is a technological problem, which then raises the free speech debate. And the free speech debate is fairly clear. The only social media company which seems to be fighting tooth and nail with this is Twitter, of course, followed by WhatsApp in a limited capacity, said that, boss, this is going to be a problem unless we implement it with absolute transparency. And if you don't do this, the government has very clearly told Twitter that, boss, if you don't do this, this is going to lead to the removal of intermediary statuses, which means as intermediary is somebody which is a social media platform. A social media platform is an intermediary status, which means you have no liability for anything that is being presented on your platform, because it's like YouTube. YouTube is an intermediary, right? YouTube is not responsible for hate speech on YouTube. But if you don't take action, shouldn't YouTube be responsible? Isn't that what self-regulation is about? And that is why there could be punishments against them. The law is evolving to that an extent. Which then fundamentally brings us to the issue of the right to internet. And this is very interesting. The right to internet access and the right to speak and express of the internet, as I told you before, are two extremely different repercussions of it. Right to internet access is a positive right, whereas the right to express oneself over the internet is a negative right. In Anuradha Bhasin, we've said this: a negative right to internet subject to restrictions is recognized, which means unless you have an absolute reason to, don't have illegitimate internet shutdowns. This would be a problem. In the privacy case, Kuttuswamy case, they said fine, no problem at all, but here is the issue. Any restriction on freedom of speech and privacy, or the right to practice any profession, anything over the medium of the internet, over the medium of internet, if it is imposed by the state under Article 19, must always have to have been passed to the test of proportionality, which means whether it is a restriction under Article 19 or Puttaswamy largely deals with restrictions to privacy under 21, they should always be proportional in nature, which means it should be legitimate. At the same time, the reason why you're doing this and how you're doing this must essentially be correlated. The justification must be valid. The measures must also be transparent and reasonable, and they should also be protected. The restrictions must also be protected, and the state must provide enough procedural safeguards. A simplified version is you should have a legitimate need to do this, you should do it in a fair manner, and at the same time you should make sure it is protected in the larger domain. I've discussed this briefly in my short video on the implications of the Pegasus order for UPSC UPSC aspirants. You can watch it on the channel. It is a video that might help you. So that's the right to internet. Now, the right to internet under Article 21 says, boss, Fahim Shireen and Kerala versus Kerala in 2019. So the High Court of Kerala said mobile phones and internet access are a part of right to life, and it's a part of the daily sort of occurrences of life. And resolutions which have been passed by the UNHRC and the General Assembly now unequivocally point to the fact that internet plays a very, very important role in linking information to education and knowledge. I mean, think about it. Most of us consume our knowledge, most of us consume our information and our opinion through the internet. Even if it is a newspaper, most of us do read our newspapers online. And therefore, the conclusion to this will always be, it's a very simple one. Technology is an enabler of rights and not a right in itself. And that is the counter argument to this. That we understand this, makes sense. You have the right to internet. But internet is not your expression. Internet is an infrastructure that allows you to have your information, to freedom to speech and expression. And as I said before, you can't force the state to do this, which is the other argument to this. So there are some positive arguments, there are some negative arguments, and to close this up, always have a balanced answer. The balanced answer here would be that freedom of speech is the basic tenet of democracy, but no freedom is absolute or completely unrestricted. The imperative of thinking of striking the right balance between fundamental rights and the reasonableness of a restriction has been a constant effort since the adoption. The only difference is this freedom of speech debate today has now reached the digital world, where you have big data companies which are multi-billionaire companies, trillion-dollar companies, and governments who want to restrict and also make sure some form of privacy or constraints exist. And this debate is only going to get complicated. The IT rules, should seek to address the concerns of the citizens without infringing their privacy while maintaining digital sovereignty at the same time. So this is more than enough for you to know everything about Article 19. If there is going to be a question on Article 19, it is going to be from these few slides, and you can close it from here. In the next video in the playlist, I will finish Article 21, where I'll talk about LGBTQ, privacy, and all of those other dimensions to Article 21, including euthanasia and everything else. Thank you for watching, and thank you for your support, and I will see you in the next video very, very soon. Thank you.